All right. Well, welcome back to the Meaning of Money, a live show for founders, investors, and families who have already made money and are now focused on what wealth actually makes possible. I'm Stefan Whitwell, and I am thrilled to have Mark Ferrier with me on here today. Mark is a proven entrepreneur, founded 7 companies, sold 3, co-founded Capital and Co. Is that right? And Capital. I got that wrong.
Correct.
And Capital.
Correct. Yes.
And looking forward to diving in here. Welcome, Mark.
Yeah, it's awesome, Stephen. Listen, you and I had a great chance to connect about a week and a half ago. It's super cool what you chat to your audience about. And, hopefully you and I can have a great chat and get to some of the parts that, you know, I've learned through both sides of the equation, selling a business and now acquiring businesses from founders and all the good, the bad, the ugly truths in the middle. How about that?
There's quite a few out there. Well, let's start with the when people are working towards that exit, it's just such a big the first one in particular, such a big monumental event, and at a practical level, often for many people, one of the big benefits is just finally getting some needed liquidity, some cash flow that comes in,
Yeah.
and there's kind of a bunch of emotions that come with that. I think many people leading up to that point think, oh my God, so many problems in my life are going to be solved now that I have money. True or false? And what was the experience like for you?
Yeah, I think the answer is I don't know. I think it is true and false. And I don't want to overcomplicate the answer, but I think it's true and false, right? My story I can talk about exclusively, and I can give you a bit of history from some of the other partners because we've been on the other side of writing those checks that are transformative for people right now. And I think in our case, or in my case, in my wife's case, I came from a very background that didn't have a lot of money, and so this was the end goal of life was to sell our business, right? And
Yeah.
we had the opportunity to do it at around 45 when I sold it. And the reality was that was it. Like, I worked my entire life to be able to do it, get a check, and move on. And I think we're thrilled we did it because we did it, I would say, for about half financial reasons and about half in our mind was life reasons, about spending time when I had young kids and being able to have some flexibility and being able to make sure that our kids could go to any school they wanted to and that type of thing. And on the flip side, I would say, both things happened. We had some financial relief. I think what you realize is the lens that you put on it may not be the lens that you put on it in getting there may not be the lens you need getting from there. In other
Yeah.
words, whether it's enough money or it's the right type of money or it was structured properly. I think in hindsight, if we just score ourselves on a scorecard, we'd probably give ourselves a B minus. I think we got some things right, but not a lot of things perfect. I think we didn't really fully think through what life after an exit looked like, from stuff like cash flow to daily expenses to growing kids. Kids are least expensive at 8 years old. They're very expensive as teenagers and going into adulthood.
Ain't that the truth?
And so, I think that would be the first part that I would say is the answer is it
Yeah.
could be. I would
Yeah.
think what the from is, not just the to, because us founders run so hard to the to. I think that would
Yeah.
be part one for sure. And then the second part that I would say to it though is there's an emotional part of yourself, right? And as an entrepreneur, that's a big part of your purpose in life. It's a big part of you look in the mirror and all of those things. And the thing that I would say I learned, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong because I don't think any of these things are that dramatic, was, I went from 100 miles an hour to zero.
Mm.
And that seemed like the goal. But I got to tell you, when you're sitting in that zero part of the goal and you start to ask yourself around purpose and what defines you and what gets you excited and what drives you, um, I would make sure that I factored that into any of my exit on a go forward basis, because I would say my experience in going from 100 miles an hour and having all this human energy around you and dynamics around you and offices around you and you're on planes and you have excitement and you're in meetings to, hey, I have my entire day to do whatever I want, seems like the goal. But I'm not sure it is in many formats or structures. Let's put it that way.
It can be scary and overwhelming and confusing, I think, to many people. So what you just said, okay, I think people should take that into account a little bit more beforehand. But in the beforehand, Mark, it's often itself in a different way a scary time. I'm selling my baby. I'm worried about all the details. It's not done till it's done, and there is this excitement and anticipation that's building. Often trying to get people to focus on those things at that moment in time is hard. But you have been on both sides. You know it makes a difference. How would you put into words if you were talking to an entrepreneur friend at that moment? Things are crazy. You need to give some time to think about this. It's that
Yeah,
important.
well, two things. I'm not sure that there's two things, except maybe getting married and having children, that is more impactful and emotional than selling your business. Like, I think, and you may argue selling your business was harder than having children because you always wanted to have children, right? And you never know you want. So it may actually squeak into the podium on the silver spot from that standpoint. I think there's a couple things. Don't do it alone would be one of the things. And whether you have, hired advisors, or you have trusted bankers, or you have a great lawyer, you need somebody who can be at least a balance to you of understanding the process, number one, I would say. And number two, I think you need to clearly articulate to that person that you do want a leading up to the process, and you do want some strategy post process. And the reason that's important, I think, are both sides of the fence. One is, most businesses, unless you have a very clean transactional exit, you're going to need to be around, and you're going to need to be around in some sort of role that is not easy for a founder, for sure, or can be not easy. So I think you want someone who can help you structure that part of it. And then the
Sure.
second one is, I think you want someone who's going to ask you some tough questions around, well, if you got the check today, what are you doing with the check? Right? Are you taking the check and putting it in a bank account and living off the interest? Are you spending the money? Are you going to buy a yacht, a Porsche, whatever you want to go do, so that you at least can understand what that means to you? And I think some of that we did well, and some of that, because of the background we came from, like, we didn't think we had to plan a lot. Like, it was more money than we ever saw, but it wasn't as much money as we thought. And I think that that's the
Right.
really interesting part as a founder, right? Is the check is a big check, but is it actually what you thought it was going to be for decades or generations? And sometimes it is. And I love those founders who are like, this is generational wealth. I don't have to worry about anything, but they still usually do. Or, people who have an exit that's transformative, but there's still work to be done in life.
Yeah. I also find that people's spending tends to expand exponentially, and sometimes that what seemed transformational at one point in your life suddenly uh, doesn't feel like nearly as much money as it might have seemed earlier in that journey. And there can be kind of a moment of, oh my gosh, I need to make sure I've got enough here,
Well,
even though some
the
of these
one thing,
numbers are big.
you're totally right. The one thing I would add to it is, as an entrepreneur, for the most part, we have a flowing cash flow engine,
Yeah,
right? Whether you're taking salary out of the business or dividends out of the business, or, the business is a big part of your lifestyle from a cash flow standpoint. And when that stops, it is a change. And I would
yeah,
say, as founders, as a founder, that was a change. And as now we are partnering and investing with founders, one of the things I'm super transparent with them up front is, the things that are in the business, how you run it, will not be the things in the business, how we run it, and it will impact your lifestyle. So
yeah.
let's be upfront and transparent about that. And let me help you take the learnings and plan for that, for sure.
The other thing I find is that there is also a psychological shift that can be uncomfortable for people between living off of just your money, even though that was originally your goal, versus an emotional security that comes from getting that constant paycheck. And I think that
Yeah.
can also be initially kind of an abrupt, confronting, emotional, like, oh, this is uncomfortable feeling, even if by any rational measure you've got plenty there.
Yeah.
Um,
Listen, I can only share my own experience, which is, there were a couple of years post selling the company. And to frame it up a little bit, we were very fortunate, when we closed the transaction and when I was able to step away. I was early, mid sort of 2019. I was still had responsibilities for the company. So in other words, they were still paying me for some cash flow. And then early 2020 hit and the world ended. We had no operating company. We were sitting on some cash, and that was amazing. Right. So when you think about post-transaction euphoria, I'm not sure you could have got better, in the sense of, we didn't have to worry about an operating company. We were sitting on cash, and we could go sort of live out this craziness of the world without the stresses that 90% of the world had. But I would say following that, when I realized that I needed to do more in life, that my purpose was not trying to figure out how many golf games I could get at my age. And I had young kids that would look at me and say, well, Dad, like, what do you do now? Because they used to know what I did.
Yeah.
And I tried to get back into it. I would tell you, those were some of the darkest days I've ever had, right? Because I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. Everything I wanted to do, I was trying to figure out, was I trying to be an investor? Was I trying to be an operator? I thought it was the right thing to be investing in things that, like, I understood, but I didn't control.
Right.
And we had no cash flow, right? And then,
Yeah.
as a family, you try and evolve, and you're like, hey, we wanted to move from, as everyone was in their COVID retreats, back to reality. And, you buy a house, and suddenly you're like, oh shit, I don't have in Canada, it's a T4, which actually is like a tax bearing document that shows your income. And the government's like, well, hey, you have lots of assets, but you have no cash flow. And the banks are like, hey, you have lots of assets, but you have no cash flow. Um, that was excruciatingly hard on my ego. And my
Yeah.
ego not being, I'm better than that. My ego being, holy shit, do I feel this worthless when you shouldn't
Mm,
be, after all the success in life? So, I would say to
yeah.
entrepreneurs, you've got to be okay to ride that wave and have more self-balance and confidence. And through my family and us doing a bunch of other, like, partnerships, and me getting back to operating, I sort of got back to that level ground of understanding the ebbs and flows. But, honestly, it probably took me 2 years
Yeah.
emotionally.
It's that significant. It's not a couple week thing. I,
No,
uh,
no, no, not
I,
at all.
I really get it. So tell me a little bit about the after part. So, as you'd mentioned, there's always a transition for the owner, right? I mean, there's usually, not always. Sometimes there's a clean exit and you're out completely, but more often than not, there's an earn out. There's some period of time where you're involved, and it is tough,
Yep,
because it's no longer you're no longer in control, and there's things being done that are maybe done differently than the way you would have wanted to. How
correct.
do you coach? How do you coach? What is your advice to those CEOs? Because that's crucial to that post sale process, right? I mean, that is your
Yeah,
life for a little while afterwards, and
thousand
if and
percent.
if and if the goal is for you to be able to celebrate life and enjoy the different chapters, and that being one having a different set of challenges than the one
Yep.
just prior, what advice do you have to the CEOs on how, at a practical level, how to deal with those
Yeah. So
emotions in that situation?
it's a great perspective, and I would say we don't have that. I don't think there is one solution to that, but we worked really hard because, our investment company is not structured as a typical private equity company. We didn't go raise a fund that has to exit. The three partners in the fund
Yeah.
have
So not to
invested.
not to interrupt you, but perfect place just
Yeah,
for those watching. Tell us a little bit about your
yeah,
company
yeah.
and
So
what you do. It's
and
very
once
unique.
again,
I would say it's very unique for everybody listening. It's kind of a permanent capital
for
mindset,
sure.
which is a thing that everybody at some point, if you've been in the business long enough, starts
Correct.
thinking about. What's your,
Correct.
what are you doing, and how have you structured that to make that a reality?
Right. I think the value that you create is not about how to understand private equity. You create way more emotional depth in your podcast, which is what I love. So this isn't a sales pitch. So let me go super fast. And if people want to know more, you can reach out on LinkedIn, and I love talking to entrepreneurs. So, I think the first one is our investment company was set up in a structured way that we had the flexibility to do deals that were great for entrepreneurs that built long-term great organizations, right? In the sense of, we didn't raise a fund, we didn't build a bunch of capital that way. We had this idea of permanency. One of my partners was in basically a pension fund that had to pay people for decades, if not more. And my other partner is in real estate and self storage, which you never want to sell if you don't have to. So the way we even structured how we formed the company, all three of us had a very long term view in it from that standpoint. The second key part is we and for those who go look up, I used to be in marketing and advertising, and I joke and say us my branding of our own capital company was the worst branding I've ever done in my life, which we called the company And Capital. And the reason we did that, though, is to force ourselves to realize that writing a check for a company is the at times the easiest part, right? How do you make
Mhm.
the company better? How do you grow the company? How do you align with the founders? How do you build something that people want to go work for? So, we sort of said, hey, if we could figure out a way to do the that part first and be really good at it. And then we had capital to invest that maybe we had a bit of a different model in the marketplace. So that's how we got there. And so why is that important? Because we've spent a lot of time focusing on how do we connect with founders and do great structured deals that post deal, we're not all arguing and fighting. And, we have not done it perfectly. I would say our track record has been very good, but with a couple big learnings and misses from that standpoint. But what we have learned is this: in our world, we put founders in sort of three buckets, and founders typically put themselves emotionally and behaviorally in three buckets. One is a transactional founder, and that transactional founder typically knows that they want a value for their business. And if somebody gave them that value, they would literally leave the next day and be able to be totally okay with it. Right. And those founders should try and figure out if that's what they are, because then they can structure a deal that way.
Yeah.
The other two ones are this: is a transitional founder, I guess, probably, let's start there from a second one. And a transitional founder typically cares about the three C's. They care about their culture, they care about their customers, and they care about the community at which the business operates, because typically it employs people in a community or a micro community from that standpoint. And so those founders care about what happens post the check. Right. And so typically those founders want to stick around in some sort of deal for a year to 3 years, or need to stick around for a year to 3 years based on whatever it is. Sometimes it's 2, sometimes it's 18 months. But that's important because you need to align on those three C's. What are going to happen with those three C's? How do we value those three C's? How do we think about those three C's on a go forward basis? Because that's where the conflict's going to come. Right. You and I do a deal, you're happy with the check, you're happy with the terms. And then suddenly I shut down the office in a small town that employed 50 people, that you got to go to the hockey tournaments and the baseball tournaments and the grocery store every day. That's a big problem. People don't think it is, but it's a massive problem, right? From that standpoint. So understanding if you're that, transitional founder, I think is super important. And then the last one that we've identified is transformative. And transformative is, hey, I do want to be out, whether it's 3 to 5 years. I have a bunch of ideas for my business that I've never done, either because of capital or my conservatism or whatever it is. And we want to find a partner that wants to take our business from A to B. And I'm okay going on the ride. I'm okay working hard. And I'm okay whether some of that capital stack comes out based on performance, because we're going to double or triple the company. We're going to go acquire my competitors. But it's a very different type of deal, and it's a very different type of relationship with the founder. And so we spend a ton of time with founders trying to agree and identify which one of those three are you. And then once we're able to identify that, we spend a lot of time trying to build deals based on that. And, where our errors happened at times were when we were starting out and excited about businesses. We would get excited about businesses. We would hear the initial feedback from founders that said, I'm transitional or transformative. And if you get a transactional founder, but you're building a business based on the other two, you're going to have conflict. And that was our mistake. And we made that mistake once. I don't think we'll make it again. But that's what I would say. And I joke around it, but now people are asking me to actually build like a good person you should reach out to is a good friend of mine named John Warlow. He runs a podcast, and he wrote a book called Built to Sell. And he, he's actually asked me, he's like, well, you build a tool that founders can actually start to self-identify from that standpoint. So we're actually working on it right now, because I think it's super important. And one of our other big learnings is if you have a multi-partner on enterprise, typically all partners aren't the same. So what ends up happening is if you have 3 founders,
like 100% of the
time, you do one type of deal.
Yeah.
Someone in that deal is going to be pissed off, and it's not going to go very well. So part of our advantage is we actually can go to those founders based on our structure. And, if you have a $10 million enterprise value and you own a third, we actually could structure it a third transactional, a third transitional, and a third transformative, based on the partner. So that takes a lot of work. And I would say that is not typical in the marketplace, and it's not easy. But that's also why we don't try and do spray and pray investments, right? We go deep into the investments we do because we're entrepreneurs. And I've seen the bad side of it, which you and I are talking about, and the good side, for the record.
No, it makes a ton of sense. I've never thought about applying that. So like in our company, the goal is to figure out, as many firms do, personality tests and identify what are people really passionate about? What do they like to do? And what do they not like to do? I mean, I've got somebody on my team that she is incredible at certain back office operational stuff. And if she's telling you the truth, she'd be happy never talking to another human being again.
Right,
Um,
right.
Incredibly important part of the team. You have another person who would be happy not to be doing the stuff she does, but prefers to be talking to people, and
Absolutely.
just and simplifying. But I mean, when you stick the wrong person in the wrong seat, it's just impossible. And I never thought about founders in the way that you divided into those three categories, but you're 100% right. I mean, if the deal structure and you're setting them up with the wrong kind of mindset of what that founder is looking for or wanting, then it's just going to be a and it's just a really interesting framework, and boy, I think it makes such a ton of sense because the human dynamics in these things are just at least as powerful, if not more powerful, than the theoretical fundamentals of the transaction. I mean, I remember as a young banker,
Yeah.
I worked at James D. Wolfenson. It was then a really big M&A boutique, and we had a client who was a very acquisitive CEO of a large bank in the U.S. And he was constantly meeting with CEOs of smaller banks that he wanted to acquire, and he would have us do the fairness opinion. And as a wet behind the ears, fresh out of school kid, I thought a fairness opinion was where the CEO was asking us what we really think of the deal,
Right,
and after a couple of years, it became very apparent that no, he was just asking us for a fairness opinion to cover his butt from a legal standpoint. He did not really want our opinion on whether he should buy that company or not because he'd been in the business
right,
for 30 years. And he knew he wanted to do it, but it all came down not to our analysis. By the way, we often spent all nighters trying to get right.
that's right.
it
Modeling.
came,
You got to
came,
model it.
I gotta model it, right? It came down to this is before Claude, where you could just
Yeah.
that's a whole
That's a
other
good point
subject.
too.
But
Yes.
but it all came down to whether that guy could have lunch with the company he was looking to acquire, and those two CEOs could stand each other for lunch. And if they could get
Yep.
along, that deal's going to happen. And if they got
Totally.
and if they couldn't, they didn't get off on the right foot, and the CEO of the smaller bank did not like that particular gentleman, then it wasn't going to happen, or it was going to be a hostile takeover. And in something that regulatory intensive, it was better not to go that route. So, I mean, it was just amazing to me, because here I was, I went to the Wharton School and studied really hard, and grades and analysis, got to understand it, and the fundamentals, and it's all
Absolutely.
logic, analysis, all night work on it. And at the end of the day, it's all whether two guys can get along at lunch.
Well,
Yeah.
it's funny, right? I think one of the advantages we have is that I didn't come up through that, right?
Yeah.
Like my partners are way smarter than me at that. And, especially, our partner that really leads our investment strategy, Pablo, he's super smart. And him and I are a great partnership because I am the entrepreneur, right? And for me, I'm way better at the intangible things and understanding how to
Mm,
model those, for lack of a better term, than
yeah.
how to model the financials or how we're gonna, do the business deal. And I think that combination gives us both the IQ and the EQ, which
Yeah.
actually helps, right? Because these are human
Oh,
beings, right? They're not models, to your point. And so, yeah, it's and by the way, please take that by it is not perfect. And I think that the other thing we've done is we've been a perpetual learning organization that we're okay with the mistakes. And sometimes the mistakes suck because you got to go to a founder and say we screwed up, or I've got to go to the next founder when they ask me the hard question of, did you do every deal properly? I need to, stand and say no. I wish I could go back and do one or two deals differently. Um, and to the best of our ability, we try and fix those and learnings, and we try and wear them as t-shirts, as I say, so that we're not hiding from any of those things. Because I think in our world, and that's why I try and do these podcasts, which is we're not trying to have some secret sauce. But the more information we can share about the learnings, the more positivity we have, because we love the entrepreneurial spirit. We know a bunch of businesses in North America need to transact in the next little while. And we'd like them to transact in a way that keep these businesses employed and these communities employed and all of those great things. And we want people to get excited about these businesses. And we want the sellers to understand there's a leading up to it, there's a transaction or there's a post. And we want the buyers to understand that maybe if we look at the buying a bit differently, we don't have to keep buying and flipping businesses to make capital. And that would be our goal.
yeah. No, it's the long term outlook. I think is so important and highly lost sometimes in today's modern quick culture of, TikTok, 5 seconds. If you can't do it in, 2, 3 seconds, if you can't do it in one quick transaction. One of the things that we do in our practice, we do a lot of tax strategy, tax planning, and
Yeah.
at least in the way that we practice it, which is where we try to aggressively implement all the low hanging fruit, the stuff that's admittedly even boring, but clearly black and white, at least in the U.S. from an IRS standpoint. It can sometimes take. I mean, a plan might be 10-year plan,
Yep.
and I
Agreed.
have to pinch myself and laugh at just how countercultural that is, because a 10-year plan, it's like, are you crazy? But whether it's a business or
Yeah.
tax planning or just raising a child, one ought look a little further ahead, I think, to get great results. And I've got a book on my desk from Charlie Munger that I haven't finished reading, that I picked up. I guess it was a year ago, a little over a year ago, at the last shareholders meeting in Omaha that I went to. And of course, listening to Warren talk about his history, which he did a little bit more because it was
Yeah.
the first meeting post the passing of Charlie, and it was really very moving at many levels to see the deep friendship and brotherhood, and partnership that these two men had built together. I mean, the depth of their friendship and their relationship, and very different people, right? They're very
Yeah.
different personalities. They were not shy to fight or disagree, and passionately hash out ideas and tease each other. But there was a deep love between these men, and there's so many great things that have come out of not only their long-term relationship, which I think reflects their spirit of longer-term living, but also obviously how they approached business. And of course, there's all kinds of neat examples where they bought businesses because they wanted that,
Yeah.
that owner that would stay on, and found their own. I think there's more than one formula. You have yours that I think is working really well, and that you're kind enough to walk us through, and if dare say that Warren might have his own model that's slightly different, but may share some things in common. But what is in common is that longevity. I mean, he's looking to acquire companies in part to get the business, but also the great management teams, and has I think profited extremely well because of that. And that's just, again, different than a lot of the culture today, which is all around immediate results. I mean, everything is about speed, 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 latency, latency, latency. I even remember how Google came out a few years ago with a challenge of like the 5-second marketing video,
Yeah.
and it was, what I like about that on a positive sense is there is a tremendous distillation and discipline to try to create, distill the core of your message down to the simple. And there's great insights and power that comes from being able to be that clear about what your core is. On the other hand, not everything can be, accomplished in 1 second.
Well, so a couple things. One, let me maybe start there and work backwards, because I think something you
Yeah.
said, I've never actually heard anyone express, but I think it's a super, super important thing that I have not had the opportunity to lean into. And I think as you're saying it, I want to make sure your listeners hear it, because I do think it is insanely important. But, listen, I have a habit of oversimplifying everything. I'm sure if you ask anyone who works with me or lives with me, on my best day, it's a great talent. On my worst day, it's the most irritating talent in the world. Um, but, the one thing you said that I'll also bridge back to Buffett and Munger is, everything lives in this TikTok fast world. But I think there's another component of that to entrepreneurs. And that component is um over, and I don't know the right word, but it's like this overhyped, over communicated, how everybody sold their business for $1 billion. Right. And everyone's flying on private planes and everyone's doing all these things. And that's the benchmark, right? Is, oh my God, just go on social media and you'll understand how this deal closed. And I actually think that's toxic to some of our founders. I really do, because I think it either devalues how you think about yourself and the value you create and the value for your business. And does that mean if I sell my business for $5 million, I'm a failure because that person sold it for $1 billion because I don't have a private jet and don't care about it? And I think that the divergence of those thoughts are not good right now. And I don't think they're good right now for multiple reasons. One, we need to transition some of these businesses, right?
Yeah.
Just, supply and demand of these services. Like I keep saying, AI, until AI can put in HVAC and keep our kids safe in school, we need HVAC companies, right? We need plumbers to make sure the toilets work. And these businesses are not all billion-dollar businesses and these big celebrity celebrations of how they sell. And so I think from a founder standpoint, I don't think all of that is healthy. And I think that we do need messages like yours around founders who've done it and what is reality. I don't know if reality is the right word because everyone has their own different reality. What is at least a different perspective? Let's put it that way, right? That's the first piece. And then I think the second piece that I don't think is healthy in the celebritizing transactions and the wealth of information and the speed at which you can get it is I think it narrows down the lens of what selling a business's key priorities are. And I always joke and say, like, the multiple, right? The multiple is the one that drives me the most crazy. And where I'll bring this back to Buffett and Munger is I think he once said, I'll buy your business for $1 billion if I can pay, $1 a year for 1 billion years, right? Like, no problem, I'll pay that amount. And I think that that's part of what we've got into is like, hey, if I don't get this multiple or I don't get this, and this is the way I
Yeah.
value my business. And what we always say to founders is the multiple just gets us on the playing field. That's it. And then we spend way more of our time on deal structure. Which type of founder are you? Tax structures, to your point, that they're complicated. What is the longevity of your business? What are we committing to? And so we frustrate founders at times. And I always joke and say, we like business brokers and we're super supportive of it, but we end up with the bridesmaid way more than we do in the brides with brokers because, we're always like, sure, we'll give you a multiple, but we're going to give you a realistic multiple because we don't believe in bait and switch. But more importantly, we're going to exhaust you trying to talk about deal structure. And in a broker situation, that is painful for them because they want to put value, and it's their job, right? Put values in front of founders, and so we always say, look, we're happy being the bridesmaids, but once you get to the point where that structure doesn't work based on the multiple, please call us because we will work our asses off on the structure side. And so, I think those two thoughts that you said, I don't think people spend enough time on the celebritization or the Hollywoodness or whatever word we want to use of the unrealities or unrealisticness sometimes of what deal structures are. And I think founders need to have way more self-confidence in that's not how the world really works. And your business has great value, and spend time on the things that matter to you and understanding if you're, transactional, transitional, transformational founder, and spend time on deal structure, to your point.
Yeah. So I'm going to bring Keith Richards into this conversation.
There we go.
I don't know if you've read his book. I have a really weird kind of diverse set of music tastes. And look, I'd be the first to say he's not like my top, if I have one musician I go to, he's not necessarily my top pick, but I fell in love with him when I read his book, Life. And one of the things that really jumped out at me that was cool was his description of the early days in that band. And before they had money, before they had celebrity, and they were couch surfing, and they didn't give a shit.
Right.
What they did care about is they would spend 8 hours trying to get this right sound and going to listening to other musicians and experimenting with other ways to explore the sound or this vibe that they were trying to figure out. And,
Right.
and what really jumps out at me is just that passion behind what they were doing. And although I'm sure they, of course, you benefit from the wealth that they've gotten, which has been, enormous. I'd be willing to bet that his greatest joys, he would say, come from his family and just his true love for music. So I think one of the other things that entrepreneurs need to be thoughtful about is finding some aspect. It's going to be different for every man and woman, but some aspect of the entrepreneurship journey that they love, that's meaningful for them, that's fun for them. Because not everything about being an entrepreneur is fun or easy. So if there's some aspect of it that you enjoy, my challenge to entrepreneurs is to, again, I lost 3 friends in the last 2 weeks, just different circumstances.
Sorry,
And it hits home about the importance of making sure that you're grounded, and there's you love what you do, and you take time to stay grounded in that appreciation. And to your point, when you get too hung up on the certain aspects of the exit or even the number, because some of the numbers, are more than you need, right,
Yep.
by any normal standard.
Fair.
And when you're in that area, a lot of the emotions and ego and all these things, and it's just like, remember what you're in this for. And the to, and I think that needs to continue regardless of what type of, which of the three types of CEOs you are, or the founders you are.
Yep.
I think it carries through to that challenge of understanding what is your purpose. So I always say true wealth is lived. It's not a thing that you own or have, but it's lived at the intersection of health, wealth, and purpose. And purpose is often one of the toughest things for people to figure out, particularly around that time of transition. Um, but even beforehand, I heard this great clip that a friend forwarded me. She worked for a billionaire in the oil patch here in Texas, and he was given a big award by the Business Council, and he had this great video where he talked about, the importance of getting rich slowly. He says, "Yeah, I attribute
Yeah.
the billions I've made to the fact that I got rich slowly. We were not in a rush." And he said sometimes, not just as a celebrity, but there's this rush. I have to make this number fast. I have to get big fast, and there's this implicit rush behind the word scale. And ironically, Buffett would always talk about compounding, which is just doing little things, little things, little
100%.
things, little things, little things that add up and accumulate into shocking amounts of impact. So I think that the the clarion call to founders, regardless of what stage of you're at, is dig deep and find the aspect of it that is meaningful for you, and embrace that, and find some way of embracing that through the transaction, but then maybe finding new ways to realize how important that was to you, and find new ways to create meaning in your life. So like one of my favorite, and I'll go ahead and put you on the spot, Mark, but people, how people spend their money also tells you a lot about them.
Yep.
To your point earlier, if all you do is go out and spend a bunch of money on Porsches, like, okay, if we were getting to know you by just looking at your balance sheet or just looking at your income statement, what would we learn about you? What would we learn is important to you?
Yeah. Well, uh, you asked me an honest question, and unfortunately or fortunately, the reality is I answer them, and sometimes I shouldn't. How would I answer this? The only thing I bought when I sold my company was a brand new F-150.
Nice.
And interestingly, the reason for that was, my dad had one, right? And when my dad passed
Mm.
away, I took over his, and it was one of those things that I probably, when I ran my company, could have afforded that or a fancy car, but I just didn't because of my bringing up. And so it was the only thing I bought, and I put my dad's license plates on it. So it
Oh,
doesn't
that's
mean that we
awesome.
haven't bought other things, but that was it. But I think what you said is super important. And a very, very good friend of mine sold his business, a guy named Jeff Cullen. And these are not his, I don't think he came up with this, but he lives by this super well, which is, you spend so much time trying to get to success, but as an entrepreneur selling your business, you've got to find a way to move from success to significance.
Yeah.
And I just think it's such a great way to frame it up, because success for all of us as entrepreneurs, unfortunately, is competitive and comparative. And
Yeah.
usually, as entrepreneurs, I say, one of our best attributes is eternal discontent. So that is not easy, right? When your attribute is eternal discontent, and your mechanisms are comparison and competitiveness, that is not very fulfilling some days, right? But I would also say, besides my family, which, I have two daughters who I always joke and say I was not a full
Mm.
human being because of that competitive and comparativeness until I had daughters who taught me how to, slow down and understand the other half of life is the emotional narrative and conversation, which has been amazing. I don't think I understood what the significance part looked like. And by the way,
Mm.
I don't still today. I think I'm working on it. I think I'm trying to figure that out. But I think that, when I said earlier, going from 100 miles an hour to zero, I think some of that was the gap between success and significance. And I joke on my bad
Mm.
days and say, I think I went into the shadow of the valley of death, which is a dark place, because it was like two
Mm.
cliffs, right? Which is, success was over here, and success was defined by selling my business for a number that was I was a failure below that number and a success above that number, which is ridiculous for the record, but that was the number. And significance. And I think that, I fell off the cliff a little bit. And I don't think
Mm.
I realized the hard work it would take to climb back to significance and some sort of balance. And so, my
Yeah.
perspective to founders would be, I would believe, based on my perspective in the marketplace that I was in and the size of transactions that I'm in, that aren't $500 million checks, for the record. I think if you can understand a little bit emotionally of starting the runway to significance before you transact, I would say, I think you're going to have a much more holistic, successful transaction,
Yeah.
beyond the financial pieces. To your point, which I love why you do your podcast, right? Because, like, sure, there's the money part, but there's the emotional part, there's the intellectual part, there's a purpose-driven part, and I think that not enough people in this space spend enough time on all of those. And take that as my learning. I think that when I joke and say I went into the shadow of the valley of death, I think it's because there was a gap between those, and I didn't build a bridge. And I tried to jump, probably, and I didn't land very well. And it took a lot of work, right? And I'm still working
Oh,
on it. And I think the other thing I've realized is, um, I didn't define success properly enough, because people ask me every once in a while, would I sold my company in hindsight? And the answer is, of course, yes. But then if you really push me, I'm like, well, if I had all the knowledge I had today, maybe not,
yeah.
right? Based on a
Yeah.
bunch of stuff. So I love how you spend, and I love how thought provoking you are around the emotional side, the intellectual side, and that you try and frame it differently than the transactional side. I think it's amazing what you're doing for founders.
Let me ask you another question. So, another interesting kind of 100 miles down to zero problem that we have in society, I think, in some, society wide, whether you're an entrepreneur or not, is you have this 19, at least in the US, you have this 1950s concept of retirement. Of, you go from being fully employed to you retire, and then the next day you're fishing or doing something, but you're not working at all. And a lot of people in the US, they that's not a reality for them. They need to keep working to make ends
Yep.
meet. In many other cases, people just get busy with grandkids or whatever. I have yet to meet a single client who actually lives that crazy kind of 1950s outdated notion. But specific to the business world, one of the things that does happen is there still is this actual kind of retirement concept where, okay, so and so stepping down and now they are out of the company. And when I lived in Japan, they had this really neat model where a lot of the dudes who were older and quote retiring, they would step down from their position, but then they would be retained by the company to quote work for 10, 20 hours a week, but
Yep.
no defined responsibilities at all. Zero. Just be available for us to talk or come to lunches or come to a meeting or whatever. So there's this really cool continuity of relationship where it gave them some purpose so they could mentor, but because they had no work responsibilities, it allowed them to be apolitical and just get out of it completely and see it from a different perspective. And likewise, tremendous assets of experience and relationships that the guys now in the formal seat of responsibility surely value being able to tap into. What are your thoughts on, in North America, on ways that entrepreneurs or non-entrepreneurs who um, can what are some different paths through which they can mentor others? I mean,
Yeah,
or have
it's
you
a
seen
great
interesting
question.
models that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I don't have an absolute answer. So if I go in circles, maybe there's at least some breadcrumbs along the trail, right? I think the first one is, there's two businesses that I owned that I basically had to walk out of, and I was done. And mentally and emotionally, that made absolutely no sense to me. And I'm a
Yeah.
wealth of knowledge, and yet, I remember when I walked out of my last business, I literally took a picture off my desk that my wife bought me, and there was nobody. And I think it was a Sunday, and I walked out, I shut the door, and I felt like it was like a sitcom, like Cheers. You remember when Sam Malone shuts the door of the bar and he's like, "It's over," right? And
Oh.
that's dating you and I, right? Because half your audience is not even going to remember what I said. So, um, but what we figured out is a couple things, right? One is,
Yeah.
and we haven't done it perfect, because if you look at all of our transactions, I think we've got it right in about three, and I think one for sure we didn't get it right, but we do what you just said, right? So founders that want to not work, that we sort of completed the transaction, we keep on as advisors for perpetuity.
Oh, really?
And yeah, perpetuity, as long as they
That's
want to do it.
awesome.
And sometimes those flux on how it works, sometimes it's salary, sometimes it's expenses, sometimes it's whatever.
Yeah.
And there's one of them we pull back in randomly. We're doing a sponsorship in one of those communities that's a significant sponsorship that's going to be a big deal. And I'm like, hey,
Mm,
Randy, we want you to be in the PR and the press because you started this business in this community 20 years ago. And one of our other founders was on sort of one of these
wow.
advisory deals, and he was passionate, wants to do work. This is crazy. He's actually working a night shift for us as a safety officer for 5 weeks. He works from 4
Wow.
p.m. to 4 a.m. Because this is his fun to still have a purpose.
Yeah.
And this in his mind is his play money that he still has to earn, right? And so I always joke with
Yeah.
him and say, whenever he takes one of these gigs with us, I laugh and I'm like, hey, Jamie, like, are you upgrading the suite on the cruise that you're going on in Alaska because you're working the night shift? But I think the secondary piece to it is I think that we are going to be in a significant knowledge gap if we just let all this expertise go. There's an amazing
Yeah.
professor at Harvard named Arthur Brooks who talks about the two phases of life. And I'm going to butcher it and oversimplify it, right? But the first one is the intellectual and learning and doing. And the second one is, having that advisory and coaching experiential impact, right? Where
Mm,
I've been through it, I can coach you, I can mentor you. And I think that it's one of the things we think about a lot. And I think there's some organizations out there that have amazing models of boards or advisory boards, and especially businesses, some are doing a better job than us, even when they're in the roll-up strategy of those founders sort of get elevated to the advisory board and then they advise across all of them and their resources that can be pulled back down. But I'm totally with you. And I think we've always ingested this idea of reverse mentoring as well, which is the young or
mm.
mentoring our older, people in the organization. And I actually try to put an hour in my calendar, or one of our team teaches me about technology every week, and it's the most humbling thing. And I move it and she gives me shit and I'm trying to put it back in and all those things, because I think we're trying to keep that whole ecosystem of learning going. And
So,
I don't think there's a perfect model. I think the one thing that I would say I think is important in that model is, whoever's running the business needs an extreme amount of humility,
yeah.
right? And for us, I get it jammed down my throat because I'm not a subject matter expert in the businesses we're in, right? So that's part one. And then I think the second one is that, you want the founders to, even on their last technical day of their deal, still have a high level of curiosity,
Mm.
right? Have a high level of curiosity of what could we do or how could we do it? Or, hey, if you call me if you have a new idea. And I think it's an active sport. I don't think that's a passive sport. And I don't think we get it right every day. If you found our founders on a bad day, they're like, why hasn't Mark called me in a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks or a month? And on a good day, they're like, oh my God, I'm jazzed and excited. But we
Look,
would, yeah, yeah. So
mm,
that's how we're doing it. I'm not saying it's perfect, but we're giving it our best shot and we're learning as we go.
I think that's really rare. You're one of the few, maybe the only firm I know of that offers that kind of lifelong continuity, and just so smart and unusual. So very cool. Hats off to you. And given the flexibility of the arrangement, I think that's even better because every founder is going to look different. They're going to want different levels of engagement, and but not having access to that to me is just insanity. I see it in my business. There's a bunch of PE firms that are buying wealth management firms, and a lot of guys that are just taking that transactional, they're taking that check, and
I, I
they're
wish I
out
could
of
tell you I
there.
took credit for it. That's all my partner's idea. So that's all my partner's Pablo idea, which is a great idea. So we embraced it, and it was a great creative solution to many things.
Yeah. So speaking of reverse, kind of reverse mentoring, I can't let you go without asking you your take on AI. You've got a lot of different people out there saying it's the best thing since sliced bread, going to change the world. Other people saying it's just horrific. It's going to end up with this tremendous knowledge gap and make everybody dumber. I know you have an opinion, Mark. Give it to me.
Yeah, so yeah, man, I have an opinion which I think is just that, right? And I always say I I never give advice, but I will give an opinion. So um let me maybe start in our world, right? So in our world, I
Yeah.
feel like, we're in the world of safety. We got to get
Hmm.
people home safe every night to go to their soccer games with their kids, or, dinner with their family. And so I think that there's a big part of our business that is practical. We have a training facility that we are hypersensitive, that we want it to be practical, we want it to be hands-on, we want it to be the best hands-on. And I think in our world, if I'm very honest, I think at times we aren't embracing the and enough. And I think that this is an interesting thing, right? The aura of AI, I think, is scary and dangerous and exciting at times because you're like, well, if you don't adapt, it's going to wipe you out and AI is going to run your world. But I think it's scarier in our world to accept the and, which is we need that practical piece. But if we don't
Mm,
embrace how that makes us better to our customers, how we collect data, how we provide safer environments because we have more information, how we can, provide better training on scale, all of those things. And I think at times we think it's the friction of it's an or, right? Like you
mm,
don't put that training program in AI because it won't be as good. And I am, it terrifies me that we don't live enough in the end. So, from our
mm,
level, I would say AI, the scariest place, probably emotionally, intellectually, and from a business standpoint in our world is embracing the and every single moment, every single day. And we
mm.
don't have it right. And I would say it keeps me up at night. So from our standpoint, I think AI moving from an or to an and in many sectors and many businesses is an uncommunicated and untalked about element that we need to figure out. So that would be one. I think the second one being, I do think that we're in this gray zone of where does effort equal outcome? And
Mm.
how is that going to transform industries and jobs and a bunch of things, and you know what I mean by that. And once again, I use examples of our business that can go forward is we push our teams to use AI to bring efficiency, um, but at times the quality is dropping significantly. Yes, we're getting an output, but you said something super interesting the other day, which is sometimes the clarity in working hard on something to get it down to one page is the effort and in the hard part, right? But if I type in, hey, give me interview questions, which I'm actually going to go to today, this is a live example for a new role we're hiring, between Claude and ChatGPT, it's going to give me an amazing list of questions that's going to be 4 pages long and probably not get to the heart of what's the real issue in hiring this person. So I'm going to still have to go do
Mm,
2 hours work on it, right? To see like how do I narrow this down to us getting to what's going to be really, really important. And so I
mm.
think that there's that gap, and I would say I watch it with my kids in school, and I watch it with our teams. That it's this outcome based focus that I think we need to use AI for, which is yes, it can speed many things up, but is that the outcome we want, or do we just want to get there faster?
Yeah, I
And then at
love
a
it.
very macro level, look, I'm not an expert in, and I love ingesting some of the content that let's call it fiction maybe at this point. I'm not sure any of it's fact yet, but I do think it's going to be really interesting because there is some really outcomes out there that are perpetual, AI acceleration, right? Which is the companies that are going to force against AI sooner or later are going to get their marketplaces impacted, and then they're going to be they're going to be the highest implementers of AI. And so um, I don't know exactly where it's at. I am not going to predict the future. I think for the today, I think it's an amazing tool. Um, I'm terrified when it becomes the primary tool.
Yeah.
And I'm as terrified when it isn't a significant tool in our daily basis. And I think that balance between those two things is an active sport. I don't think it can be a passive sport, would be the way that I would look at it. And I think the last thing I would add is I don't know. So I am a humble learner and a high level of curiosity about it, and I try and not have hard lines. A great prof once told me, have wide boulevards and high curbs. And I kind of think away. That's how I think about AI these days. Is I have to have a lot of flexibility where we play it, but I can't let it impact our business too much that we're in a death spiral. So wide boulevards and high curbs is my AI strategy right now.
I couldn't think of a better way to put it. Mark, it's been amazing having you on the podcast today. Thank you for being so open and just humble and sharing, your perspective, which I think is really helpful for everybody watching because you've done this. You've sold a bunch of businesses and you're actively living on both sides. And I think you've given some really great. I know I've really gotten a lot out of your framework that you created, kind of the three different types of founders, and how you apply that. So thank you again. Great getting to know you better. Appreciate your time today, and above all, your opinions. And may we all be challenged to keep those boulevards wide and the curbs high.
Yeah, and listen, one last thing. Thank you. and to your audience, I think it's super important what you do. And part of the reason I jumped on when you and I had our first chat was people don't talk about enough about the whole entrepreneur, right? The emotional side and all the things. So thank you for doing that. And I think more people need to do it. So if you and I can ever collaborate again to sort of bring that whole view together in any format, my phone number, I'll always pick up the phone because we need more of it, man. I really appreciate it.
You bet. You got it. Thank you, Mark.
Awesome, man. Have a great day. It was amazing. Reach out
You
anytime.
too.